Oda.
Greenpeace is disappointed and farmers are happy. So have you got the balance right?
Look, it is really important that every part of the economy, all sectors, including agriculture, pay for their emissions and do their part in reducing the pollution that we put into the atmosphere that causes climate change. The initiatives announced this week include a significant program to roll out some of the changes that are needed onto farms. That is actually something that both Greenpeace and the Green Party campaigned for over previous years.
Okay, let's talk about the details of some of that. We've got a pop quiz for you this morning, Minister. Your first emissions budget runs till 2025. How much are you asking farmers to cut their emissions by then?
During the course of the first few years, we're not actually anticipating farm emissions to come down more than a couple of percentage points.
So it's 2% in that first budget. What about the second emissions budget?
Well, over the course of the first 10 years of the 15-year program, we're anticipating farm emissions will come down about 10% in total.
Yeah, so when you're asking the rest of the country to sacrifice and slash emissions tremendously, farmers barely have to change at all in the next 10 years. Is that fair?
I think it would be fair to say that agriculture is about 10 to 15 years behind the rest of the economy in terms of making those changes. So there's some momentum that's already built up in other parts of the economy, and that is because those other parts of the economy have been part of the emissions trading scheme for over a decade now, even though for most of that decade the settings were such that it wasn't very effective, but people were getting used to the idea that they were going to have to. Agriculture, that's really only been true for about the past 3 or 4 years, when we passed that legislation in 2019 that said that they had to cut methane in particular by about 10%, or no less than 10% by the year 2030. And so it is going to take a while for that to start to take effect. It is really important that we actually work with farmers to ensure that they are adopting those practice changes, adopting the technologies that they can as fast and as comprehensively as possible. We've spent about $200 million over the course of the last 10 years on agricultural research, but a lot of that hasn't yet been rolled out on farms, and so the emphasis has to be putting that into action now.
So you're spending $700 million now to increase that technological spend after very little progress, really, in the last 10 years. That's a huge proportion of that $2.9 billion, and yet you're telling me farmers will drop their emissions by 10% in 10 years. Is that value for money, Minister?
Well, you'd have to put that to the Minister for Agriculture, who's responsible for the part of the plan that is about bringing down agricultural emissions. We have said that we're going to be bringing in a climate change minister,
and this is half of our emissions. So why don't you have control over those targets?
Well, I'm responsible for the overall plan and ensuring that we collectively hit our targets, and I'm satisfied that the plan that we've got does hit those targets. You have to remember that those targets were given to us on the advice of the Independent Climate Change Commission. I have repeatedly said that I would have liked us to be going a lot further and a lot faster, particularly in the domain of agriculture. But we did set up an Independent Climate Change Commission led by experts to advise parties, no matter who the government was, on what the direction of travel should be. And so ultimately our plan is responding to that advice.
One of those technologies that could help with emissions is genetically modified animals and crops. Is it time for New Zealand to think about changing that law?
Look, I think ultimately if you look at what our overseas markets are demanding, it is for organic, regenerative, high-value products, and there's a very clear bias against products with genetic modification in the mix. I mean, I've seen reports in California of people trying to sell bottled water that's GE-free, and of course there's no genetic component in water at all, but it's just such a strong consumer component that I think it would be extremely risky for the industry to try and to use those technologies. But ultimately, I think that, if people want to take that risk, then they've got to make a case for it.
But the world's moved on this and the science has moved on too. The Green Party's always opposed genetic modification. Isn't it time for you to move on too?
I think that there's a debate in the Green Party about, this area of policy as there are in many other areas of policy. But ultimately, you've got to have the public on side with you. And there's, questions around the science, and obviously the scientific community is saying that the most recent generations of this technology around gene editing and so on is safe. But you've also got to look at what consumers want and the risk to the value of your product and the brand. Well, I'm the co-leader of the Green Party, and so my role is to represent our policy on this. We think that it is too risky to the value of our products to be able, to go down that route. But there is a debate there. The government itself has got has said that's not on the agenda, but if public demand is that it moves in that direction, well, maybe a future government might open that up. But ultimately, I think you've got to look at what is the risk that we are prepared to take, and I don't think that that's a risk at this point in time that is worth taking. I think that farmers are able to produce food for much lower emissions than we put into the atmosphere at the moment, for much higher value, and we know that there are farms all over the country that have actually increased their on-farm profitability and at the same time reduced their emissions, not because they're going to any kind of science-based solution, but because they're changing their business model. So it doesn't even require new technology. It just involves doing something differently that we already know works. And that is the emphasis that we want to have in this plan when we're working with farmers, to say we know that there are some things that work. We need to roll that out around farms all over the country, get those changes in practice that are adopted. If there are technological changes that we already know works and that we already know doesn't undermine the value of our brand overseas with those high value markets that we're aiming for with our agricultural strategy, then let's do those things. If people want to continue doing research in the lab in the background, and if there's something that comes out of that that's safe and that consumers will expect in the future, then, great. But let's not sit around waiting for some kind of silver bullet. Let's get on with the things that we already know work.
Okay, Minister, just quickly before we go, look, you've said this emissions plan has a Labour hue. What would a green emissions plan look like?
Well, the Green Party would have introduced agricultural emissions pricing immediately upon getting into government, and so that would have meant that farmers were contributing to the scheme that they're currently getting benefit out of now. I think we probably would have pushed further on things like, electricity generation, the rollout of rooftop solar, and so on. But okay. I think any government who is responsible for this on such a broad scale, with 15 ministers and 18 portfolios and 22 government agencies involved, whoever the government of the day is going to put their hue on those plans. So I think, as I've said before, if people want a plan that's stronger on climate action, then in about 18 months they're going to have the opportunity to vote for parties that are leading on climate action.
Okay, lots more to do. We'll have to leave it there this morning. Climate Change Minister James Shaw, tēnā koe. Thanks very much for your time.
Kia mautunu mai e te iwi. Stay with us. We're back after the break.